Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Inclusive Ship Show, the place to get practical insights to make inclusion happen in the business world. I am Thais Conquan, your host, and today I'm absolutely delighted and honored to have here with me Patsy Doerr. Patsy, a warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. So Patsy is currently the global head of corporate responsibility, sustainability, and inclusion for Thomson Reuters. And Patsy, can you tell us, can you share a little bit of your story to become who you are today and what exactly you are doing?
Sure, happy to. Absolutely. So I have been at Thomson Reuters for 6.5 years at this point. I started to build the diversity and inclusion function for the firm 6.5 years ago. And then about 4 years ago, I was asked to take on sustainability and corporate social responsibility as well, and to integrate the three under one umbrella and to really bring that to the forefront of who we are as an organization and integrate it into our business strategy. Prior to that, although I lie about my age now, I spent 20 years in investment banking, in talent. So I have my master's in organizational development and talent development. And I was at JP Morgan in New York, Deutsche Bank in London, and Credit Suisse in New York and Hong Kong for many years. In fact, I was based in Hong Kong working for Credit Suisse when I got recruited to come back to the United States to build out the diversity and inclusion function for Thomson Reuters. I guess the one additional thing I would say is that throughout the course of my career, I've never taken an existing job. I only take build outs or transformation change projects, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's exciting. Starting from scratch, actually.
Absolutely.
The way you would like to say, yeah. Patsy, in regarding inclusion and diversity specifically, how did you become involved with this topic?
Well, that's an interesting story as well, and I'll try to keep it short, but I would say that it honestly, and this may sound a little bit corny, but it started with my mom, who passed away 12 years ago, but she was really a pioneer of her era. She moved to New York, one of six from Louisville, Kentucky, in the 50s to come to New York to be a writer, to never get married and never have children. Met my father, and 4 children. I'm one of 4.
4 children.
Yes, exactly. And, she really taught us, frankly, that we, all 4 of us, three girls and 1 brother, that we were capable of doing anything that we wanted to put our hearts to, and that it was possible to be a mother, to have a career, to be an athlete, and all of these things. And so I tell you that because that's really where my passion for women in leadership started. When I was quite young, I ended up going to an all-girls high school and then to an all-men's college. So I was a second class of women at Washington and Lee University. And that was also where I continued to kind of cultivate that passion for women in leadership and starting things from scratch and really doing it, gender neutral, if you will. And then when I went into banking, which is primarily, as you know, over the years, primarily a male-dominated industry, it was really an opportunity to build out my own career and to focus on others in terms of how do you build out an inclusive culture. And that's where the passion continued to grow.
In inclusion and diversity, it's such a broad topic, isn't it? There are different diversity and inclusion topics within, there are different approaches, the more organizational approach, the more leadership, approach to the topic. Do you have a favorite topic within the largest theme of inclusion and diversity, Patsy?
That is a great question. In my view, there's a couple things, and it's hard to have a silver bullet response to that, but I will say that I think it's really important as you build out a diversity and inclusion function, or even an existing function, to really have that balance between diversity and inclusion. So diversity is representation, right? So whether it's race, gender, ethnicity, or otherwise, getting the talent into the organization. But the inclusion piece is critical as well. And you have to focus on that at the same time, because you can bring in as many diverse people as possible, but if the culture doesn't support it, it's never going to work.
What's your killer argument to convince people about the value of inclusion and diversity? Because in your case, you had a wonderful role model at home. It seemed that it came quite naturally for you, isn't it? But there are so many people who don't get it. And how do you engage those people?
So it's a great question as well. And I think it all starts with the business case for sure. And in fact, that's where we started when we went down this journey 6.5 years ago, which is basically to help people understand that there is so much research out there that proves that having a more diverse and inclusive workplace and leadership team at the helm actually enhances employee engagement, innovation, productivity, retention, and the bottom line.
And do you think that's enough to engage people's hearts as well?
Well, I think you have to engage on both levels. In my experience, having the data, and there's a lot more data behind that statement, right, with facts and figures around the actual impact on the bottom line in terms of stock performance, revenue generation, and the like. But in order to engage people's hearts, a lot of what we try to do, and I feel strongly about this personally as well, is to create that environment, as I mentioned earlier, that allows people to be their full selves. And a lot of that is really around courageous conversations, having open conversations about differences in opinion or experiences or approach, etc. And that, in my view, really helps people engage from a heart perspective, if you will.
Oh, I love that, Patsy, about the courageous conversations, because it feels to me that sometimes, also because of the politically correctness thing, people actually they avoid engaging in conversations, in the, touchy conversations, and that doesn't help at all, to create a more inclusive environment. So your focus on courageous conversations, I think that's really important.
Good. No, and I agree with that too. I think, unfortunately, and on a global scale, with our geopolitical environment the way that it is, people tend to get more nervous, to your point, about having these open conversations. And the only way to really address diversity and inclusion is to be able to talk about things openly and allow people to feel comfortable doing that.
In concretely speaking, how do you empower people to have those courageous conversations? Because sometimes it's a skill, isn't it? For some people, it's easy. For some others, it's not that easy.
That's true. I think there's a variety of ways to answer that question. I think number one, as a diversity practitioner and to speaking to practitioners out there in the marketplace, it's important to ensure that the function itself is not seen as a policing function or a policy function, right? It's more about creating a strategy and, again, an environment, a culture that's part of how the business operates. So therefore, people don't see the function as, oh, I can't say this in front of my diversity professional. In fact, I should be able to say whatever I'd like to. It should be quite the opposite. And so that's a lot of it, I think, in terms of making sure the function is viewed that way. But also, I also strongly believe that diversity should really be part of the organization's business strategy and how the company defines itself. And then that allows people to engage in a different way. And at the same time, education, right? So educating people on what the appropriate way is to have these types of conversations. And then again, to hold people accountable for building diverse and inclusive environments within their own teams.
In talking about education, Patsy, there are so many articles that say that training doesn't work. Unconscious bias training. There's many articles and studies that challenge the effectiveness, of educational initiatives in this field. How do you feel about that? And what's your point of view on that?
Sure, I have a strong point of view on that. So happy to advise. So a couple things. Number one, you can't over focus on education either, to your point, right? You really have to look at the entire employee life cycle, from recruitment to development, to engagement, to retention and advancement. So you have to be looking at the entire spectrum at the same time. So that's key. The other piece is, to your point, I'm not a big believer in diversity training as a standalone. Certainly unconscious bias, courageous conversations, understanding inclusion are all part of the education process, but I believe they should be part of the broader leadership development curriculum that the company has in hand. And so in our case, we felt very strongly from the beginning that in order to be an effective leader at Thomson Reuters, you should know how to build and lead a diverse and inclusive team. And so it's part of the leadership development program as opposed to a separate exercise where people come in, get trained on diversity, sign a paper, and leave.
I agree. It is really like you are really embedding the whole inclusion and diversity thing into the existing leadership and training initiatives.
Absolutely.
And from what you were saying, I understand that there is no magic bullets, to create a more inclusive business world. And you mentioned the employee life cycle. I'm assuming that it's got to be systemic. But out of all the initiatives that you've taken, Patsy, what's the one that was really effective? The one initiative that you were really proud of in terms of results and return on investment?
Well, for us, I would say that one of the things I'm most proud of on behalf of the organization is that we developed a diversity and inclusion index about 2 years ago. So Thomson Reuters, as I'm sure you know, is a data organization, and we have a large environmental social governance database that tracks ESG data on 7,000 companies around the globe. And so part of our strategy has been to, as I mentioned earlier, bake diversity into our business strategy, but also leverage what we do as a business to create a better, diverse, and inclusive environment. And so in that theme, we created a diversity and inclusion index that allows us to measure our own progress, as well as all other companies, the 7,000 companies that are part of our database, in terms of how well they are doing around diversity and inclusion and how they can improve, including ourselves, to be more effective in that way.
And how is the index performing, regarding the benchmark?
It's doing really well. It's actually quite interesting, right? It's based on 24 metrics, which include development and diversity and retention and things of that nature, but also news and controversies. And I tell you that because, to your question, it's performing well because by tracking news and controversies, we're able to rule out those companies that talk a good game about their diversity and inclusion, but may not actually have an effective strategy. Because a company can say a lot of great things, but if there's news out there or cases out there or complaints out there, clearly it's not working. So we've been able to monitor it as well.
Wow, and I find the index, you mentioned earlier that it's so important to have a robust business case for inclusion and diversity. Certainly with your index, that helps you with your own business case with everybody, really. And I'm actually, because I knew about the existence of your index, and I'm surprised to see that people don't quote your index as often as they should, as part of the business case for inclusion and diversity.
That's interesting. Well, and I think there's always, it's still fairly new. It's only second year, although we're going to relaunch it again in September with the top 100 companies globally. So there's always an opportunity to get the communication out there more broadly so that people start talking about it more. But we'll be doing that again in September. So very soon, more to come on that.
Great. And what's the most common objection you come across, and how do you respond to that?
In terms of diversity?
Yes, in terms of diversity.
Well, I guess if I think about the journey that we've been on, and I even think about before I took on the diversity and inclusion role 6.5 years ago, oftentimes there's an issue of certain populations feeling that they're being targeted in some way. So for example, when we launched our leadership program for women several years ago, there were some women who said, I don't want to be part of the program because I don't want to be seen as someone who needs extra help versus somebody else. Mm-hmm. And that is often the case with diversity initiatives, that certain populations will say, I don't need extra help. And so the response that we have to that is twofold. Number one, it's not extra help. We're trying to put everybody on a level playing field. And we're not only offering a leadership program for women, or we also recently launched a program for our Black talent. We're also running a whole bunch of other leadership development programs that are available for anybody. So it's really important to kind of build that into the messaging, as well as to explain to people that the reality is there is research out there that proves that certain populations have tendencies towards certain behaviors. And it's important to have programs that address those issues.
It's interesting, isn't it? How is the population who are the beneficiaries of those initiatives who might have objections around the topic? That's interesting.
Yeah. And, it makes sense. Even on a personal level, I can understand that. I mean, many people don't want to be seen in any way, shape, or form as needing extra help or needing, certain development. But at the end of the day, to your point, you're the beneficiary of the program as well, right? So it's a matter of helping people understand what the benefits are.
Yeah, in which well, it makes me think of the meritocracy question as well. For some people, the moment you say inclusion and diversity initiatives, you are going against the meritocracy principle. You are favoring people not because they are the best ones or the most qualified people, but because they belong to a minority group. And have you come across those types of comments, Patsy, and how do you respond to that?
Absolutely. I've come across that many times, internally and externally. And from a personal perspective, I am not a believer in quotas. I do believe in targets. I do think it's important to have targets in order to change the culture, but not quotas, because I think
How,
there's,
what's the difference for you?
well, a quota assumes, to your point earlier, that you're actually choosing a diverse candidate over another candidate based on their diversity, as opposed to their skills and what they bring to the table. And so I think there's a difference there. I think it's important to monitor progress, but not mandate a certain number. And so one of the ways that we've addressed that personally and professionally is that at the end of the day, we're trying to address this whole concept of unconscious bias, not pushing diverse candidates to the forefront. And by doing that, what we do specifically, to give you an example, is we mandate diverse candidate slates. So if you're hiring for any position, you need to have a certain amount of diversity on your slate. Now, that's not saying, to your question, hire the diverse candidate, women, or whatever the category may be, for lack of a better word. We're saying open up your mind to the possibilities of different types of individuals and then let it go from there.
And when you say that diverse slates, do you mean gender, more specifically gender diversity slates, or it could cover any other diversity dimension? How does it translate?
Any aspect of diversity that we can track. So it could be race, ethnicity, gender, or otherwise. So it's any type of diversity. We want to make sure that there is a diverse candidate slate of all different aspects, not just gender.
Okay, perfect. And Patsy, how about, what's the best way to deal with non-inclusive behaviors? And I think that question has become even more relevant after the Me Too movement. There are some things that we took for granted, like, there's no, the basics, there is no harassment in the workplace. We've gone beyond that. But I think the Me Too movement showed to us that that's not the case, that there are still inappropriate behaviors out there in the workplace, and how to deal with that, how to prevent and how to respond.
Right. No, that's a great question as well. So it gets back in many ways to education again. I think people need to understand what micro inequities are. So micro inequities are those behaviors that people do without even understanding it themselves, in terms of devaluing people in the room that might be different from them. So we've done a lot around education of micro inequities, balancing behavior to make sure that you're entirely inclusive in the environment, right? And so that's really important. So education is one. Number two is holding people accountable for these issues, right? So we've built in, and I would suggest this to any organization, into our performance management system, that part of what we're tracking in terms of your performance rating is your commitment to diversity and inclusion. So that's about 30% of what we call our people goal. So leading people in a positive way, but also contributing back to diversity and inclusion in a meaningful way. So you're educating people and you're holding them accountable.
Oh, that's interesting. And how, in terms of metrics, which metrics are you using to measure that?
That's also a great question. We have a variety of different metrics that we have in place. And so one of the things that we do is regularly, as an organization, report back to the heads of our different business units how well they're doing from a diversity representation perspective. So how many women in leadership, for example, how many Black talent are in leadership positions, things of that nature. We report that back regularly so that they can actually have an accurate picture on a global basis as to what their population looks like. We're also able to use metrics around our engagement. So our engagement survey, a lot of organizations have that. We have one. We've built in a number of questions that ask people how they feel about diversity and inclusion at Thomson Reuters. And we're also able to cut the data by population as well. And say, oh, actually, our women are feeling less engaged than our men, for example, or vice versa. So those are a couple different metrics that we use, representation and engagement.
Ah, great. Yeah, because for many people, I think diversity is more easily measurable, isn't it, for many people? I mean, some aspects of diversity you can measure more easily. And then you mentioned the engagement, which I think is a great way to measure inclusion, which is not very clear to many people. I've been to a conference not long ago in Paris where there was a huge debate about, how can we really measure inclusion, as if it wasn't really possible. But I think you were giving an answer to that, isn't it, about using the engagement scores cut by demographics. Are there any other inclusion metrics that you are using, Patsy?
Yeah, I mean, it is primarily the engagement survey because I think, again, it gets back to embedding diversity and how the company operates, and how individuals operate within the company. The other way is more qualitative, frankly. So in addition to the quantitative aspects of an engagement survey, having ongoing feedback discussions with certain populations, and frankly, everybody across the organization to understand qualitatively, do they really feel that this is a diverse and inclusive environment, right? And getting that information is critical as well. So you've got to have that balance between the quantitative and the qualitative without overemphasizing one over the other.
Okay. And what would be your key advice for anyone who's driving inclusion and diversity? Anyone is starting or trying to refresh, it's his or her approach to inclusion and diversity?
Yep, absolutely. So there's a couple of things I would say. Number one, know your business. Right? I think it's important, historically, to be brutally honest. I mean, diversity and inclusion was seen as a soft issue, right? So people are like, oh, diversity and inclusion's over here. It's kind of a people issue that's not really a business issue. So I think it's important to know your business, understand the business case for diversity and inclusion, be able to quote specific numbers around that. What is the impact on engagement, productivity, and the bottom line? It's also critical to have support from top leadership. I mean, our CEO, when he took his position 6.5 years ago, was very clear on saying that he wanted to have diversity and inclusion part of our strategy. So having that senior leadership support is also critical. And I would also say that it's important to really by making the business case, also engaging with your business development people and your sales people in the way that you can actually get out to clients, talk about diversity and inclusion, have an external role in addition to the internal aspect of promoting it within the organization, because that, again, adds credibility to the business case.
It's a very smart way, I find, isn't it, to engage external clients. That's really the bottom line.
Absolutely.
In Patsy, you mentioned getting support from senior leaders. And you are lucky you have a CEO who's really engaged and committed towards inclusion and diversity. But there are so many inclusion and diversity practitioners who are not as lucky as you are. They don't get that full support at the very, very senior level of the organization. What can you do about that, when you don't have that? Not yet, let's say,
Well, I think it gets back to the business case again, because certainly, even though we've been so lucky to have strong support from our CEO, but over the years, when I was in talent and investment banking, I confronted a number of skeptics and continue to. And I think the way to confront skeptics is through numbers and really through the business case, and to demonstrate, what the impact is, as I mentioned earlier, on the bottom line. I think that's really the way to start. I think also it's about establishing credibility for the diversity and inclusion function. So as I mentioned earlier, not making it a policing function, but rather a strategy, culture, and change function. And then you get more credibility over time. But it does take time, and there are skeptics. So I think it's important to bear that in mind.
Okay. And what do you see, what is trending right now in the inclusion and diversity field?
Well, I think it's an exciting time, actually, because of the pressure coming from the geopolitical environment, for sure. What's changing is that companies on a global scale have a much more important role to play in this space, not only within their organizations, but having a voice in the world about how important these topics are. And you're seeing a lot more organizations, including ours, working together, signing on to collective agreements, whether it's the UN Global Compact and the Sustainable Development Goals or otherwise, but companies coming together to say, this is important to us and we have a voice and we want to make a statement about it, both internally and externally. So I think that's exciting. The second thing is, it's no longer, as I mentioned, seen as a soft issue. People are really starting to understand that in order to be an effective business, you really need to, at the end of the day, putting gender, race, ethnicity aside, it's really about just getting different perspectives, approaches, and the best minds in the room. And people are starting to understand how important that is.
Great. That's so positive. Patsy, I think we need that, that positive mindset. And just to finish our conversation, do you have any favorite quotes or books or TED Talks that you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, I'm going to answer that in a hedged way, maybe because I come from financial services. I always believe that you can learn from every person that you encounter and every situation that you go into, as opposed to having one role model or one mentor. I have multiple mentors and advisors because everybody has something different to bring to the table. But I will say, having said that, one of my favorite quotes is from Madeleine Albright, and you may have heard this, where she says there's a special place in hell for women that don't help other women. And frankly, I would adjust that and say there's a special place in hell for people that don't help other people. I think it's really important for us, well, particularly women, but in general, for us to really help bring people up the line. More junior people, younger people coming through their career, my children, others coming through, to make sure that we're also advising them and developing them as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Patsy. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, I would just say that this is an exciting time for diversity and inclusion, and anybody who's in this space should take advantage of that and really take risks, push the envelope, and try to make a difference.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patsy. It's been a wonderful conversation. And thank you. And if anyone in our audience would like to contact you, is there a better way to reach you?
Sure. I think LinkedIn is probably the best way for me if that works for others. So I'm very happy to do that and respond accordingly.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, Patsy.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And thanks everyone who listened to us today. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. It would be great if you could share your key insights in the comments. And if you liked this episode, like it, share it. And if you want to learn more about my work and how I support companies on their inclusion journey, visit my website, www.theclickinternational.com, www.declicinternational.com. I hope to see you in the next episode. Until then, embrace differences and make a difference. Bye.